Hey everyone, it's Colin. How's it going? I'm filming this just a few days before Christmas in 2016, and I just realized it's been almost exactly 20 years since I got a copy of what would become my favorite console video game. Stick around and we'll talk about why I think it's so special. If you've watched most of my videos, you may already know the answer to this one. I talked about it in a previous Q&A episode, but I can't really say I have one overall favorite video game. There are just too many. But in terms of console-based video games, I've got a pretty clear winner, and that is Mario 64. I know some people are going to be like, dude, that's the lamest game that you can possibly find fun and your favorite. But hear me out, because there's something about that game, at least in my mind, that really sets it apart, and I don't think has been replicated, at least not very frequently, ever since. The first thing about Mario 64 that I love, I will admit, comes down to a bit of nostalgia. As much as I talk about nostalgia on this channel, especially in these podcasts, I'm not immune to it either, right? I get hit by that just as much as anybody else. In fact, some could say this entire channel was started based on a sense of nostalgia. But I got a copy of Mario 64 the Christmas that console had come out, as a lot of people did. It was a hot item that year, if I remember. And Mario 64 was one of those games that you were very likely to get if you got a console. And the thing with Mario 64 and that console, part of the nostalgia was, of course, I was young. I had always wanted a Nintendo branded console. And if you watch my episode where I do a review on an AV cable for the original Model 1 Genesis, I'll include a link to that one up there. You can go watch it. I tell the story about how I always wanted a Super Nintendo and never got one. I still kind of felt that way, even, as the next generation after the Super Nintendo and Genesis came out. And my parents ended up getting me an N64 for Christmas. I'm pretty sure that's like the only thing I got for Christmas that year. But I got an N64 and a copy of Mario, and I was incredibly happy. And the thing that I loved about that game was like that sense of satisfaction of, finally having what something that I had really wanted, but also that it lived up to my hopes. A lot of times it's like you get wrapped up in wanting something really bad. It ends up being better in your mind than it actually is. Like you get so worked up about you want it so bad and you think that's everything you need it to be and everything you hope it to be and all that, and you finally do get it and you're let down a bit because it's not as good as you thought. With me though, Mario 64 totally lived up to it. Just, even today, I can't be happier with that game. There's nothing that I would go back and change. There's nothing major about that game that I'm like, oh, I would love this game more if only not for this one part. No. I love everything about the game. I love it as it is. It's in my mind, it's perfect. So, what about that? What about the game itself is so intriguing and fun to me? There's a few different levels. I think first was the notoriety of it, right? It came at a time when previous consoles were largely 2D. It was all just side scrollers, especially with the Mario franchise, but even just console gaming in general, it seemed, was very largely flat and two-dimensional up until the N64 hit. I think largely based on processing power of consoles. Obviously going from 16-bit consoles to 32/64, because the N64 didn't always run in 64-bit mode. That was a major leap in processing power and allowed developers to do so much more. But I think it was also a rethink in the way that games were played. You go from this kind of flat, static side-scrolling action to this three-dimensional turnaround open world type of map. And that was kind of mind-blowing back then. So that was a big factor in kind of cementing why I liked that game so much, just because it was so fresh, it was so new. And of course it wasn't the very first, 3D kind of game, but I would argue that it was one of the first mass market, really popular ones. The other things about Mario 64 that I really dig, I really like the aesthetics of that game. Even though it's fairly limited. I mean, it's one of those games where at a casual glance, it looks really complicated. You're kind of surprised at how much they were able to put into it in terms of creating all these different worlds and everything, yet fitting it, within the capabilities of the console hardware, and then also within the confines of the small amount of storage they had on those cartridges. Sony, even though I think the PlayStation may have had the same, if not slightly less processing power, Sony was able to get away with more with the PlayStation simply because of the media. Compact discs could hold a lot more storage than an N64 cartridge could, orders of magnitude more. That's the reason why Final Fantasy switched from Nintendo platform to PlayStation, incidentally. They were just able to do so much more with it, going off of compact disc media. But Mario 64, one of those games that you look at it and you go, wow, I'm really surprised that they were able to fit as much as they did in that cartridge. Well, you look a lot closer at it, it turns out they were just really clever with what they were able to put into it. They were able to reuse a lot of textures in places, for example, a lot of sprites and everything, but it's not obvious. You look really close and you can tell, oh yeah, they're just reusing this texture in this one world from this thing in this other world, but it doesn't hit you in the face right away. So I'm really surprised. I'm struggling to come up with the right word. I'd like to say amazed, but I don't know if I'm really amazed by it, but I'm impressed. There we go. We'll go with that. At just how efficient that game was written. How much they were able to pack into it given the capabilities of the hardware and how much storage they had available to fit all those assets into the cartridge. So it feels like it's a game that's bigger than the sum of its parts, in a way, with what you get out of it. I love the visual style. I know it's really kind of clunky and blocky and everything, compared to what we get today. People who didn't grow up through that era may look at that game now and go, oh, that game looks like crap. Look at how horrible those textures are. Look at the lack of definition in it. Everything is really angular and everything. There was only so much they could do with the geometry of objects in that game. A lot of times they cheated and substituted just 2D flat objects when they could get away with it, like trees. Trees are always flat. You spin around a tree and it always looks the same. Some of the tricks that they were able to do like that. But I really liked the look, the kind of the visual style, the theme. It felt like that game had a lot of cohesion to it visually from the art. But what I also think is really interesting is that game has aged incredibly well, even from a graphics perspective. You look at it now and it's like, yeah, compared to modern 3D games, it doesn't hold up. But that's only in comparison. On its own, taken as an example of what was one of the biggest games for that platform, it holds up incredibly well. And it's still fun. It didn't age poorly. It's not a game that, in retrospect, was more fun when it first came out, looked better when it first came out because of the excitement and everything. You were a little kid and everything, than it does now. It's just as fun. It's just as engaging. It's just as enjoyable now as it was back then, I think. And I don't think there are very many games that can do that. Even going through and like replaying some of the Final Fantasy games. I'm not saying that they're not fun to replay now, even though they're just as old, decades old. But there's something about some games where they don't age as well, maybe because you don't have that excitement to play them the first time, because you've been through them once, you know what's coming. Some of the parts that are less appealing become even more less appealing, like grinding, through missions, trying to power up and everything. You can only run around the world map, in Final Fantasy so many times trying to find monsters to level up and everything. That kind of gets old after a while, and it seems to get old quicker now than it did back then. Thankfully, the gameplay in Mario 64 avoids all of that. The thing I like about that gameplay is Mario 64, and maybe this is the biggest thing to me about why I like that game, is it's very approachable from multiple levels. There's a story to it, of course, just like there is to every Mario game. There is a story, but it's not like a lead you through the story type of game, right? You don't have to follow a specific path to play that game and win. You have to do some things before you can do other things. But there's nothing that says, you have to follow a strategy guide type of path. Do this, then this, then this, then this. A very fixed, tight order. It's really just down to, do you have enough stars to get to the next section of the castle? I mean, that's really all it comes down to. And you can get those stars to get to that next section in whatever order you want. So it really lends itself to this feeling of exploration. I like that Mario 64 feels kind of no pressure. There's no timer. There is no set path. And there's a big difference, I think, between Mario 64 and Mario Sunshine, which some argue is kind of a sequel. In some ways I agree, in some ways I don't, in terms of the way the two games play. But there's a big difference between Mario 64 and, say, like Mario 3D Land or 3D World. Just because both of them are 3D does not make them equivalent in terms of the way they play. Mario 64 was very much an open map. There's no timer. Take all the time you need. There's no worry about the number of times you get hit in a way, because you've got a power meter instead of just a traditional, you get a power up and that allows you to get hit once before you die type of a deal, where you go from little Mario to big Mario, that kind of thing. It takes some of that pressure off, where it's like, you can get hit a couple of times and still survive. So it's like, go ahead, explore, try, take that risk. Take the risk, go ahead. If you've got a full power meter, take the risk, because there are very few occasions in Mario 64 where it's an insta-kill. And even then, they give you plenty of lives to keep trying. Even within the levels, even if you do get hit, there are plenty of opportunities to replenish your power meter. Coins are everywhere. There are at least 100 coins in every level, because that's actually one of the missions you can do, is if you collect 100 coins in a level, you get a star. So you've got tons of opportunities to regain power. Water is like the best thing in Mario 64. If you've got enough water for Mario to get submerged in it and just not run across it, once he gets submerged and comes back up, instant replenishment of your power meter. And it doesn't cost you anything. You don't have to find coins or any of that. So water is amazing. It's just this game that really, I think, it feels like the programmers had as much fun building the game as people did playing it. You know, it seems like they really felt like it was just this, you know what, folks, go develop the game you want to develop based on, and just make it work on this hardware. Really. You know, don't try to come up with a sequel to what came before. Don't try to emulate what came before. Use familiar characters and themes, but don't make it be a copy. That's what that game really feels like to me. And I think they succeeded incredibly well. I think it'd be really fun. I haven't looked it up, and I probably should, but I think it'd be really fun, even just for me, to interview some of the original developers of that game. Ask them what that experience was like, what some of their thought process was. I'm sure some of that material already exists, and I should go look it up sometime. But I think that would lend a lot of insight even further into that game, being able to talk to the developers, ask them what that experience, you know, was like for them. Did they enjoy it? I suspect they did. I suspect they had a lot of fun developing it. For some reason, I feel like Mario 64 is one of those games that everyone, you know, knows about, but it's not as prevalent in everyone's minds as the other titles. You know, everyone has heard of Mario 3, and everybody can immediately picture what Mario 3 looks like. And Mario 3 shows up in all of these, you know, all the virtual console stuff, and it's on the NES Classic, and it's, you know, one of the go-to games in a lot of emulators and stuff. You know, if you're going to install an NES emulator on your whatever, you know, your Porta-Pi cabinet, or, you know, a hacked PSP or something like that, you're going to grab, you know, one of the original Mario platformers for it. Mario 64 seems like it doesn't get as much love as it should. Yet, I don't feel like there's a lot of hate for that game. It feels like people just don't seem to remember it. And, you know, maybe that's just my experience. Maybe there's plenty of love and appreciation for that game out there, just as much as some of the other Mario titles. It just feels to me like a lot of times it gets forgotten. I think that's maybe because the N64 was kind of a weird console in a way. In some ways, it really fit in with what Nintendo was doing at the time, and it was a logical extension to the Super NES, but in other times, it feels like it really got overshadowed, and it did get overshadowed by the PlayStation, which was its main competitor, and that people only seem to remember the N64 for GoldenEye, you know, if anything. GoldenEye is actually not the first game that I think of when I think N64. You know, I think Mario 64, or I think something like Conker's Bad Fur Day, or Cruisin' USA, which was, when you're a kid, that was hilarious. That's a game, a good example of a game that did not age well. The Cruisin' USA, Cruisin' World Series. I'm not saying they're bad, but they were a lot more fun when, I feel like they were a lot more fun for me when I was a kid than they are now. You know, the novelty kind of wore off on them. So, you know, it's really the whole package of Mario 64 is why I like it so much. I like every single one of the levels. They're all fresh and different in different ways. Yeah, there are some similar things between them. You know, some of the levels are kind of duplicates in that it's like you're on this big floating mountain and you need to go from the bottom to the top and do all these complete these tasks along the way. But they're all different in different ways. If there's anything that game overused, it's the slides. Because there are a few slides. You know, limiting the slides as just like a one level exclusive may have been better for that game, but again, I'm splitting hairs here. I can't really come up with a whole lot to complain about with that game. There's just so much to love. And the music is another one that it gets, you know, just like the textures in the game, yeah, they reused the music across multiple levels, but there aren't really many tracks where it gets old. And there are some really incredible pieces. The theme to Dire Dire Docks is one of my favorite pieces of video game music, of all time. And I'm a big fan of what has been done in series like Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy X has an incredible soundtrack. But Mario 64 for me is right up there, despite it being, many years older. So that's I guess, kind of a recap of my favorite console game. It's not the fanciest. It's not the most amazing in terms of technical prowess, but it checks all the right boxes for me in terms of being fresh and novel when it was new, in terms of offering really fun, approachable gameplay with interesting and fun mechanics. You can get Mario to do so much stuff. It's amazing what they were able to program in terms of just what you can get the character to do with relatively few controls, giving you that really immersive experience, not just in terms of level design, but even the way the character interacts with the levels. I mean, you can spin the camera around and stuff. I think that's one of the first uses of that capability in a video game. I don't think it's the first, but it's one of the biggest ones that lets you start to do that advanced stuff, like controlling the camera. And it came at a time when it was appropriate for all that to come out. It hit at the right time. It wasn't ahead of its time and became unappreciated. I know I'm not the only one who loves Mario 64. If I don't have time to play it myself, I'll watch a number of different playthroughs of it. And every time I find a playthrough of somebody playing that game, they'll always say that it's one of their favorite games. That was in some ways kind of the golden age of Nintendo for me. Not to say that Nintendo has lost it in terms of being able to play games, but for me, because of the age I was at the time and my experiences and what I was looking for out of gaming, it struck a chord with me. And I still feel the same way about it today, 20 years later, which is scary to think that some of you watching this weren't even born when that game came out. Makes me feel old. Anyway, so I'm curious as to your thoughts, of course. First, what do you think about Mario 64? Am I full of crap? Is it a bad game and I just have really weird taste in gaming? Or am I right in that this is a game that a lot of people like, but we just don't talk about a whole lot? Also, what's your favorite console game and why? Is it for similar reasons? Was it because of the age you were when it came out? Or is it an old game that you just discovered recently that you like? Is it a brand new game that just came out and you've decided this is the best thing ever? I'm curious as to all those thoughts. Let's continue that conversation down in the comments. Of course, I'm also soliciting feedback, suggestions for future topics. Please hit me up. I haven't been getting a whole lot of them lately for some reason. Maybe I've just been doing a good job picking them. I don't know. But if you have a topic you want me to cover that's appropriate for the podcast like this, leave a comment down below for that as well, or hit me up on Twitter. So if you like the video, I would appreciate a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at thisdoesnotcomp. And as always, thanks for watching.